thank you very much. And I'd like to salute all of you. And I know that all of you, in one way or other, have had, very exciting experiences around the world. And continue to have. And I say exciting in not just a Chinese sense, but exciting in many, many different ways. And you would allow me to salute my colleagues from Transparency International Australia in a special way. I'm very glad that a number of them are here this evening, and we've got this tremendous chapter working in the Asia Pacific, but also collaborating with the international movement in dealing with corruption around the world. And I think your points were so well taken. We very often see corruption as somebody else's problem, and forget that very often in our own countries we do have some issues, and they are sometimes what appears to be subtle. But as I say, if you give a $100 bill to the police who stops you, and you've had way too much to drink, and you get into an accident and kill somebody, it's not benign. And I was also in Norway not so long ago, and Norway, the government was telling me, we thought that we were the purest of the pure, that there was no issue here, until there was one local government construction scandal, and they figured, oh well, that's just the exception. It can't be more than that. But then they began to realize that cartel formation, collusion on construction between companies was more common than they thought. And I think if we were again just looking at that small window, that in our own countries, certainly in Canada right now, where I come from, there is a scandal in one of the big cities of Canada about collusion between construction companies, and it was just by looking over time that one was able to see the pattern, which of course costs a lot more money to the people. Or they don't get the repairs of the bridge, and something goes wrong, and in this case, as it did, and part of the bridge falls on some, a number of cars driving by, and you get some people that die. So it's not just others. In other words, it's all of us. But the costs, as you know, are huge, and whether it's dilution of vaccines in some of the poorer countries so that you can sell more under the table, and give the regular vaccine, or it could be antibiotics. Of course, they don't work, and again, people die. If you look at the Turkey earthquake, where the construction was shoddy as opposed to having been what it should have been, the result was when there was an earthquake, a large number of people were killed as a result, and shoddy construction is certainly one big issue. I don't know whether any one of you knows the Anti-Corruption Commission of Hong Kong. They're quite courageous, and it's probably one of the best anti-corruption commissions that we have around the world. And they've developed a museum of their big cases so that they can remind themselves and remind others. And it was one issue one time that a complaint was made that this company, who was building 3 very large towers, by large I mean very high towers, 50, 55 stories, had cut corners, and instead of going down, bringing the foundation to solid rock, had stopped about halfway, because they would have had to pay a fine because they were not delivering on time. So they didn't go down to the foundation. And of course, when this was reported to the Anti-Corruption Commission, they immediately started to investigate and got engineers to go and do the work. And indeed, that was right. So and actually one tower was built. They were about halfway in building the second tower, and it was ordered demolished. That was the only way of being able to deal with that situation. So of course the company went bankrupt, as it should. But again, you have situations in countries that if you did not have an anti-corruption commission, if you did not have people who feel that they can report without being threatened with their life or otherwise, then that would have gone. And of course, if any of you have been in high-rise buildings in Hong Kong, when the wind comes in, you sway. And I've often wondered, should I go down or should I just stay on the 45th floor? Or you have tremors, and so again, that could have been a major. But of course, you've got the big world issues in terms of illicit trade, and it's estimated there's about 1.3 trillion a year, which is lost because of illicit trade, bribery, and corruption of various kinds. Which is lost money, which is lost to development. And money that was taken out of developing countries by corrupt leaders. We estimate that it's about $180 billion, but that's the tip of the iceberg because it's very difficult to know. And this is only what is known, and only about 5 billion have been returned. So that money is still floating around. And some people are still benefiting, and families and cronies of the individuals still benefiting from those resources. So, we could go on and talk about the cost of it for a very long time, because the list is very long. And many countries that are poor today should be very rich. If I look at Nigeria, a country with outstanding resources in terms of oil, gas, and mining. And, it is still a poor country. If I look at Gabon, 2 million people, massive oil reserves, and of course the people are still very, very poor, while the previous leader and the family have 36 properties in France alone, 72 bank accounts, fleet of Daimler Chrysler, and it is finally in front of the courts after a lot of attempts to get it there. So, going back to sort of the kind of environment that we need, the kind of conditions that we need if we want to be able to continue to deal with corruption, are numerous, of course. And I'm often asked, do we have more corruption or less? And I can only say I don't know. But we certainly, on the positive side, have finally, the monster is out and people are talking about it. We have the conventions, OECD, UN, regional conventions. APEC, ASEAN have been, putting this on their agenda. We've got the G20 with its anti-corruption working group, which is tremendous, doing a lot of very, making solid recommendations, being accepted by the leaders. Now we'll have to see whether these are implemented by the countries. And so, there is a lot that's been happening. A number of countries have laws that they didn't have before, criminalizing bribery outside of their borders and inside. Recently, tax evasion has not only been criminalized, but by the G20 and OECD made a predicate offense for money laundering, which is taking it a step further. And so, there's a lot of very good things that have been happening. Institutions have been strengthened in a number of countries. The judiciary is much better than it was. There's greater transparency. At the same time, there's still a mountain of work to do in many, many countries who don't have the right institutions, who have the laws very often, but not being enforced, or who might have the institutions but not being resourced, and who are seen as an extension of the executive, as opposed to being oversight institutions like supreme audit, agencies and the like. So you have that that's still to be done, but also The globalization of our world has made it much easier for people to move money around quickly and to change ownership of assets that they own. And you've got 3 or 4 clicks on the computer, and it becomes extremely hard to find who is the real owner of the money that's been being laundered. And so these are the negative side of the globalization and of the information technology, which has made it so much easier to put money aside. Further, the economic crime facilitators are highly sophisticated. And many of our countries, including our countries in the West, do not have yet the kind of police and investigative capacity which is up to scratch by compared to those who are committing the economic crimes. And we're saying, in terms of perhaps moving now to what kind of conditions should we have, to what kind of environment should we create together to make sure that we can prevent as much corruption as possible and deal with it early, discover it when it happens. And of course, looking at governments, which are still very important. You want the government to have a rule of law that works. I always say justice delayed is justice denied. So you need to have a justice system that works. You need to have a justice system where at the local level the judge cannot be bought or think that the executive is expecting him to rule one way or the other, that the courts are independent, professional, transparent, and that they are doing doing their work for the people. Because if that doesn't work, then you've got impunity and you've got fear in a country because people cannot be protected. In terms of governments, again, I think certainly at Transparency International we're pressing for much improved transparency. I always say, the information that governments own are the people's information. They don't belong to the government in the same way as the money doesn't belong to the government. It's the people's money that you're managing. And therefore, one has to start from that kind of frame of mind in order to make sure that the information is available, that people don't have to be on their knees begging to have access to information, but that on the financing side, that all revenues are published in a timely way, all disbursements right to the front line are published again in a timely way, that the programs that people know what they are and highly accessible by the people, that kind of information. So that's another one, and that we need the oversight institutions. Where I was talking about the justice system, but you also have the auditors, the anti-corruption commissions or the equivalent body, so that when something goes wrong, it is detected early and that you can do something about it instead of letting it fester or not knowing that it's happening on your in your backyard. So those oversight independent institutions as checks with the executive are also terribly, terribly important. And access to information legislation, of course, is important, but you hope that people wouldn't have to resort to that all the time, that the information would be easily accessible. I was mentioning earlier today that of all countries, interestingly enough, in Brazil, who are working hard to try to open up, all the revenues that come into the government and all the disbursements going out and to whom is published on a daily basis. It's updated every day. It's on their website for everybody to see. Their procurement, which is the other issue that all governments, all levels, especially local, but all levels as well, have to make sure that their system of procurement does not make it possible for bribes to be paid to get contracts or for collusion to happen. And there are approaches. Transparency International has been working in developed some, but you know, at the end of the day, it's the transparency that counts. It's ensuring that you've got good monitoring, and we have developed integrity pacts where the people who are bidding and the one requesting the bid agree on paper to a contract of no bribery, to a contract of full transparency, and if anyone is caught offering the bribe or asking, they're either disqualified with a penalty and they're taken off the bidding process, or if it's the government entity that's asking, you start again, you start from scratch. So, you know, these are some of the conditions on the government side, and you need to have whistleblower protection. Without whistleblower protection, the people will not dare, because they have seen sometimes some of their friends, some of their colleagues identify fraud or theft, and then being ostracized by their milieu, or being fired at times. When you look at the Enron auditor, this is somehow what happened ahead of the whole scandal coming out. So I think I always say to governments, it's in your best interest not to try to hide these things, but to find them out quickly and deal with them. And of course, if this is fraudulent, that you turn it over to the police for further investigation, and to the courts. And of course, it takes two to tango, and the private sector and other sectors that are non-governmental have a very important role to play. But the private sector is such an important part of our development, of our economy, and you know, and there are a number of leaders in different sectors who are taking this very seriously. And there's a number of institutions, organizations that are working with the private sector to try to make sure that the private sector also has strong leadership. You need leadership at the top, whether it's government or the private sector, to make sure that this works. And that people know that this is the way, and that you're going to be protected by your leaders if something goes wrong. And then, of course, you want the company to have good anti-corruption programs, strong codes of ethics, solid training. We are pressing, of course, companies to publish what they pay to the governments, especially mining, oil and gas, but not only, so that this is available for everybody to see, and it protects them from extortion. And transparency also helps them to make sure that some of their staff do not commit some of that, because it would be found much earlier. And we're saying to companies, work with your sector, work with the other companies. You can compete one day and you can cooperate on these kinds of things, so that if you're in a country where there's a lot of corruption, whether it's in customs, whether it is in land licenses, get yourself together. You'll have more power, and go to the government and say, that's it. We're not going to tolerate this anymore. We're going to work with you. We're going to make a difference. And but we will not continue to be faced at having to pay bribes to get their stuff out of customs, or to interface with the government, or with the police, or anyone else. So I think that the private sector has a very, very important role to play. And again, like government, transparency is sort of the bottom line, which helps tremendously in preventing corruption and in discovering it when it does happen. And we're telling the large industries to bring, who are good citizens in this regard, to include their subsidiaries, to include their supply line, which are the small and medium-sized industries that cannot afford a compliance officer or even a legal team to help them, but to bring them into their training program and make sure that your supply line, you expect them to be on a non-bribery road, that you will not accept to have them as your suppliers unless they follow the same kind of ethical conduct that you will be following as a business person. And right now, we have a number of organizations that are trying to level the playing field, working with industry, and I think that's giving some reasonable results. What we need is to bring many more on side. We have the UN Global Compact, we have the mining group, we have the World Economic Forum, we have Transparency International, the International Chamber of Commerce, and all of us work together in developing tools to help industry and work with industry in this regard, and that's very, very positive. So at the end of the day, we have probably, if we look at the Arab Spring, if we look at the financial crisis, if we look at the Indian summer, if you look at the Occupy movement, we have a situation where we have, as a common denominator, corruption. There are many other factors that contributed to the Arab Spring or to some of these other things, including greed, but at the end of the day, the common denominator has been corruption. And what we are doing at Transparency International, we work on 4 fronts. One is we publish surveys, as you know, primarily to keep corruption on the agenda. It can slip off easily. Secondly, we have been pressing and working with institutions and groups to develop the conventions, so that in turn that forces the governments of the countries to give themselves the tools, the laws, what they need in order to deal with corruption. And the third area that we work in is we've been developing a lot of tools. We see ourselves as a solutions provider, not just as somebody that says, here's a problem, and both for industry and for governments. And we've got a basket of tools for both of them that have been useful, that people are using, and we will continue to do that. But the fourth area, which is one which is a bit more recent, my colleagues in TI Australia will understand, will know that very well, and that is we're saying it's good to work at the top. We need to do that. We need to continue to do that. We need to make sure now that we have conventions, that they're implemented, that they're enforced. We need to continue to work with the various sectors, with governments and so on. But somehow, if we don't work directly with the people, because if the people see corruption as a way of life, as just something you've got to tolerate, and that you cannot do anything about it. So, you let it be, you remain a victim, your family remains a victim, and everybody else, and your country does not develop in the way that it should. So what we're trying to do is to be able to find much better ways of communicating with the people. Not to create new revolutions, but to help people understand that together they have the power of going to their governments, of working with their industries, of working especially with their local government in identifying the problems that they face in the delivery of services, and in also helping in making suggestions as to what could be done differently. And this is where we want to work more with the people, but also try to help them by developing new tools for local government and for the people in the municipalities and on the ground that they can in turn utilize in terms of trying to make a difference in their community. So that's a bit newer, and also trying to see how we can work more closely with young people. And young people are not our future, they're the present. So I think it's very important for us to be able to, and work with the education sector. And I mean, certainly with MBA programs, engineering programs, science, medicine, because it's all there, but also with other levels of education, so that young people start early, developing a strong moral compass, and whatever they see at home, whatever they see around them, that they do not start themselves by saying that's the way of life and that's what I'm going to do. But they can question right from very early age. I can just close with one short story. I used to work in the Department of Health many years ago, and I think I probably copied Australia as we usually do, and decided that, and we looked at the data and looked at morbidity and mortality, and the greatest contributor was smoking. So there were others in mind, but we started with this one, developed a big campaign for adults and one for young people. And 3 years later, we looked at the results. The one with adults had failed totally. The one with young people was the one that contributed to the adults stopping to smoke. Because the children, we had created these dummies that smoked. So you had a Kleenex in the back and you made the dummy smoke, and of course you had all this gooey stuff at the back on the Kleenex, and it was rather visual, to tell you the truth. And we also, had short videos of lungs, real, pictures of lungs, post-mortem, of course, of those that smoked, those that didn't, and so on. And the children then would get home, and they'd see their parents smoke, and they'd say, "But you can't smoke, you're gonna kill yourself." Of course, that didn't work very well. The parents just continued to smoke. And children being children and being persistent, then they started to go home and they started to say, "You're gonna kill me!" And then the parents started to worry, and they started to go and smoke outside and stopped smoking in the car when the family was driving. And, it's rather cold in Canada, minus 35, minus 38 degrees in the winter. And they thought that eventually it was better. And, really began to see there was a double standard. They didn't want their children to smoke, but they were smoking and so on. So the story here is that the best way of getting to the adults was through the children, as opposed to directly through the adults. That was the campaign that succeeded, not the one that we had for the adults. So maybe when we're talking of integrity, when we're talking of accountability and transparency, that the children might have an important role to play in their community and in their families as well. Well, thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to engaging with you in the discussion.
Thank you. We've got half an hour or so for questions, so please, when you are asking your questions, you indicate your name and any organisation that you represent. Gentlemen.
My name is Tim Carradis. I'm a self-employed consultant. I have got 8 years experience working for the World Bank as an investigator, as well as UN a couple of times, and most recently as Chief Resident Investigator in the Congo. I got back to Australia about 6 months ago. I want to take up your last point you made, which I think is vitally important, and that is who you try to influence to change behaviour and to change the culture of an organisation. And that's been my experience working in 55 countries on all continents, conducting investigations of corruption. And I can tell you from my experience that I've got my major breakthroughs with proving systemic corruption and huge corruption by somebody telling me what was going on. And without any exception, they were the younger people, the very concerned people about their country, etc. But the most vital part of that was I didn't want to be identified. They wanted to tell me their story in secret. And so that leads me to think, well, how do you change a culture if they don't want to be identified? How do you break down those terrible barriers of corruption which is absolutely ruining these countries? Any suggestions along those lines?
This is a recurrent story. I had a call from a major international organization where information was brought to them about a case of corruption with one of the contracts, big contract. But the individual was worried to lose his life, or members of his family losing their life, if he was found to have reported. And this was within a company in the Ukraine. but he only, so the call to me was, can you help us to protect this individual? We have to take him out of the country, otherwise, and we're, doesn't want to have another identity, and that of his family, but he needs to be protected until the investigation is completed. And basically this man was afraid for his life. And if you're living in a small community and you snitch, if you report on someone, it's the mayor, and you know that, we've got, I don't know whether some of you have read The Bottom Billion from Collier, but you report many things, but one is that in Chad, on a health clinic program to build health clinics around the country, after a while, nobody's health was changing much, and immunization was not happening, and so on. So they decided to do a major review and to follow the money, as opposed to just looking at the paper trail. And they found that only 1% reached the front line. 1%. Liberia, the Auditor General was telling me that they had built 5 schools with 5 operating budgets for 3 years. When he sent his forensic auditors, it was 1 school with 5 names. Very smart. So you can't just follow the paper. But getting to your point, that's where I think trying to change the systems and people, and putting people who have power, putting pressure on the institutions to change and to find out what is going wrong, has to be there with the protection of the people. People, if you live in a small community and you report something, and your family and yourself can be ostracized, as opposed to people applauding, which is what they should do. So, I think your point is well taken, that it's much more difficult to change a situation when you have that fear than if you could feel that people are at ease and they're going to be applauded for reporting crime, because that's what it is. So one has to be able to protect those individuals, and yet very often, if you want to be able to prosecute, you need to have the evidence. And if that individual is not ready to go to court, then you're in trouble, trying to deal with the case. So you've put your finger on a very, very difficult situation. And I'm not sure that there is any one, but at least, to me, whistleblower protection is one aspect. But then you've got to make sure you have other ways also of getting at the information.
I think it's a very long-term project. It did first at a very young age and work your way through.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Kate Johnson. I'm Media and Marketing Intern here at AIAA. It's interesting because my question is related with what this gentleman just said. Whistleblower protection. What about WikiLeaks? And WikiLeaks has a very sophisticated.
What about
WikiLeaks?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, has a very sophisticated. I do want to finish my question though, because I have has a very sophisticated system in place to protect the people who blow the whistleblowers. But 2 points I wanted to, or 2 questions I have. Firstly, would you define donations that are given to president candidates in
donations to?
Donations given to presidential candidates in for say the US election, is that a form of corruption? And also, secondly, with you spoke about the importance of transparency and of the citizens knowing what's happening in the government. You also spoke about collusion, and you mentioned that collusion is a form of corruption. On that point, WikiLeaks is currently being in an ongoing legal battle, but there's a banking blockade against them. Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, Amazon, all these electronic, basically all our electronic finances have blockaded WikiLeaks. Donations that support that foundation, that organisation cannot get through. Is that not collusion on the biggest level? And it's
Sorry, couldn't you finish the question, please?
Yeah. Is that collusion? And is that corruption?
Well, I think you started with WikiLeaks.
Yes.
My telephone lines were, red hot at that time because the press wanted to see, what do you think about that? And, my point was if governments and industries were as open as possible with the information, with all the information that can be made public, and there are exceptions, then WikiLeaks, wouldn't need it, or it wouldn't be, it wouldn't go very far if that were the case. But then, at the same time, you've got private information. I don't think that you want your visa information for everybody to see with all the information that goes with it. I don't know that you would not also want to have your health record being online for everybody to see. And when it comes to also protecting the state from a security point of view, if there is an investigation going on about a terrorist plot and suddenly somebody decides to put that online, you could put at risk the lives of thousands of people. So there are situations where security or privacy matters, but on the whole, it should be truly public. In terms of financing of political parties, I think that there are a number of aspects here. First of all, I think the transparency of the donations is vital, but I think from our point of view is not enough. Because if I'm, I don't know, Dick Cheney or whoever, okay, and I get $30 million from this oil company, and the executive decides, or the Congress, that there is a private member's bill to try to deal with perhaps some of the environmental aspects of the oil industry or the climate change, sort of trying to reduce emissions. And that it is well known that this oil company is very much against this. I don't know that if that person gave me 30 million, that I may not feel some influence in terms of how I will vote on that. So I think that the extent, the amount is very important. And now, what should the ceiling be? I mean, different countries have different regime. Certainly in Canada now, companies, unions, organizations cannot contribute, only individuals. And the cap is at $1,200 per person for each capping. But then when you have something like that, I think you need also a complement by the state, which is not that much in Canada, may or may not stay. It's only about a total per vote, for each of the political parties. So the financing of political parties is a major issue, and I think it's one I'm glad that you raised. Now, in terms of whether it's by having a number of companies who decide that they will not give to a particular group, one would have to look at the facts here to say, is this some form of collusion or not? And it may or it may not be.
Michael Helden, council member of the Institute. A friend of mine was recently going by car from Nepal to India, and the border guard said, it will take us an hour to check your bags, or the equivalent of $2, and we won't. Which brought me to the point, and I remember speaking with a policeman, I think he was from Sri Lanka or somewhere, and he said that if he didn't take this money, he wouldn't have enough to live. Which brings me to the micro level of corruption, which is that basically without the extras, these people at the lower level, police officers, customs officers, are getting paid so little. Isn't that even more of a structural problem than because at least you can cut out the corruption at the macro level, at the top level, but how do you cut it out at that micro level? Because they don't have enough to live on.
Well, it's a vicious circle. Because if you're a tax person, and you've assessed me at a particular level. And but you say, you know, if you give me 100 or 200 equivalent Australian dollars, then I will assess you to half of what I've assessed you. So instead of the money coming into the government, into the budget in order to pay the people, it doesn't. And this guy makes a little bit of money, or depending on where, quite a bit. But the rest of the people cannot be paid properly because the revenues to the crown or to the government are much smaller. So, but there's no question that salaries are very important. On the other hand, the people who ask for bribes will be much more likely to ask for bribes to the people that are very poor, to the people that are powerful and who are richer. And therefore, it's the poorer that are more victimized. And very often those that have to pay don't even have a job. You know, so it's a big ball of wax. Now, I was talking to a president of one of the countries, and he was telling me we had problems with our judiciary, and we fixed it. We're very pleased. We quadrupled the salaries of the judiciary, and we did a few other things, but basically that's all we did, you know, pretty well. And the judiciary is finally operating in the way that it should. Then we decided if it worked with the judiciary, we'll do it with the police. So they did the same thing with the police. And a few weeks later in their cabinet meeting, somebody said, you know, I haven't seen any police on the street. Somebody said, well, you're right. And they started a small investigation where they didn't need to work anymore because they were being paid. So the moral of this story is that salary matters, but you also need to do other things because I think that people who are used to collect will continue to collect unless you do something, you know, you have the regimes in place, the systems in place to prevent it. But it's a big issue, no question about that.
Ashim.
Thank you very much, Dr. Labelle. My name is Hashim Abdul Hamid from Monash Asia Institute. Welcome to Melbourne, cold Melbourne. First and foremost, we have listed that Australia a decade ago was #1, the cleanest city, the cleanest government, and so on and so forth. In other words, top of the list as far as corruption is concerned. But on the other hand, our neighbors to the north and northeast and northwest, so corrupted, there's a list of it. Anyway, my question is this: what are we going to do about the corruption? Even the last few days, our Prime Minister, our beloved Prime Minister, I would say, was prepared to give President Hamid Karzai several millions of dollars, which will be no guarantee that this money will be given to the people, instead of buying weapons, buying bombs, and so on and so forth. What can be done about it? Thank you.
If I understood you properly, you know, in this case, what you're suggesting is that it is better to do development than arms? Or is it that if you put more money in the hands of people that have not been able to manage it, then the money may not go to the purpose intended? Yeah. That's what I thought. No, I think that this is where we've done a fair amount of work at Transparency International on the whole development file, development assistance, which is very important. Let's face it, you know, countries that have very little needs the solidarity of people from around the world who have more. The question is how to do it in such a way that it doesn't go into the but then in the pockets of individuals and out into fiscal havens and the like. And therefore, you know, sometimes you have to do joint oversight. Sometimes you have to be able to say the money, yes, is there, but on the condition that we are able to follow the money together to make sure that it goes to the purpose intended. Of course, some countries are very proud at the other end and are not very interested in that. But I think, and you want to make sure that you don't punish the people of those countries as a result. But I think that there are different ways of providing development assistance if you feel that providing it directly means that it just goes into a big black hole. And I know that the World Bank, some of you have been involved with the World Bank, has been doing quite a lot of work, and a number of donors, to try to strengthen the capacity of the country's institutions. But very often when you have corruption, it's not because the institutions are necessarily weak, it's because it's a way of life that people have adopted. So you've got to have more than just strengthening the institutions. And to me, if I use money from my country to help another country, I want to be able to tell my taxpayers that I know where that money has gone. So, the follow the money, the sometimes joint oversight, or agreeing to an independent oversight that cannot be bought, are some of the measures. But some of you who have worked internationally might have additional, suggestions as well. But I think it's very important that this be protected.
Yep, Clara.
Sorry, Kitty from the AAA. Who funds Transparency International?
We are funded by 3 sources. One of them, actually I should say 4, and I'll come to the 4th one in a minute. The first, those who provide us with more resources are the development agencies. And this is primarily for our chapters in developing countries, where the donors, the development agencies, which are primarily the UK, Australia, Sweden, Canada, Norway, France. You have a whole list of them in our annual report. So the bilateral donors, about 10 of them. Then we have foundations. And here you have the bigger donations are from Hewlett-Packard, Gates, Ford. These are some of the bigger ones. And the private sector, we have some organizations, especially in the accounting field, that provide us some resources to support our indices, our survey work. And we have a number of companies that provide, a certain amount per year for an extended period. But usually these are smaller amounts, 10,000 or 50,000, as opposed to millions of dollars. So our total budget is, depending on the year, but more recently around 22 million euros. That is for the international body. Then each chapter, and we have 90 odd chapters that are already accredited around the world, raise their own resources. And sometimes we try to help and support them with some of the resources we have. And so my point is that the developing country chapters have much greater facility because the donors are on their doorstep and saying, please help. And that is very useful. On the other hand, our chapters from Western countries have much greater difficulty. Now, the 4th source is sweat equity. Our chapter in Australia has a tremendous number of volunteers who provide their time, fully or in part, to the program of the chapter. Internationally, we have the same thing. I'm in a bonded situation. I'm a pro bono person, and so are the members of the board. But we also have other individuals that give a lot of their time, who are specialists that one could not pay for. They could be an ex-justice of the Supreme Court. They can be a senior partner in a law firm, retiring. You've got people who have been senior partners in accounting firms. A number of people. You have academics are involved.
Patrice McCarthy. Are you able to give us any information about progress China might be making toward stamping out corruption?
I think China is a very, very interesting country in that their Ministry of Supervision is responsible for, first of all, training people, ensuring that there are compliance people in countries, in their government departments. And this is also to do not just training, make sure they have the people, but also to detect, to respond to problems that occur, and to use their language to punish the people, and that can be from being fired to being executed, depending on the degree of the crime, of the economic crime. And so, there's a lot happening in China to try to deal with corruption. It's 1.4 billion people. There is a significant amount of corruption, and they recognize it and they publish it internally very widely. I've seen a number of the documents that they have published, and even in the state, the China Daily, or in their equivalent to The Economist, there's been some very strong articles denouncing the level of corruption that needed to be dealt with. They now have a law as of February 2011 that came into effect in that spring, criminalizing bribery outside of their borders by their companies, state-owned and private. We still don't have a sense on how that will be implemented, whether it will have teeth or not, okay? Because the impression that people have is that the Chinese companies that are operating, and state-owned companies that are operating around the world, especially in the resource sector, do not, they will not follow, it seems, the same rules as some of the other companies that have strong compliance programs, and if they're asked for a bribe, that they apparently are more likely to go. And I say apparently because you need to have the evidence to go further. So on one hand, it's paradoxical because on one hand, they have a lot of detection and sanctions internally. On the other, we're not sure yet of how their new law what kind of regime will emanate for what's happening outside of their borders. We have a chapter in China. It took us many, many years before we finally accredited the chapter, because we did not want the chapter to be an extension of the government. We wanted it to be able to be more independent, and we're generally satisfied, and we've seen some of the publication that they have done, which has been quite strong, but they're also trying to help with especially their local government issues, which are quite important. So it's a very interesting country, and very entrepreneurial people. And the regime has changed so much. When I started to go to China in '94, and I've been there about 15 times since then, in every province except Tibet and Inner Mongolia, people needed the equivalent of visas within China to move from one province to the other. Within a very short time, that disappeared, etc. So, the movement of people is now free, and there are many things that are free in that country which were not, in terms of freedoms. But this is an issue that they're very worried about, because they know it has the potential to destabilize their country significantly. And it already, is contributing to, they see it as a major problem. So I know some of you have been in China in the last few days, and so I don't know who you met, who you spoke with, and I doubt that this would have been an issue that was raised if you were a group visiting and you were not necessarily known, to them. And it depends on who you meet as well.
Well, perhaps I can just say a brief word on
Yeah.
behalf of the people who are in China. Certainly, I endorse everything that you said, that the Chinese leadership has made it abundantly clear that anti-corruption is one of their highest priorities for the next 5 years, and they do put a great deal of store on doing something to eliminate corruption. On the other hand, as you say, it's an enormously difficult problem to eradicate in China, as it is in any other country. While we were there was the case of Bo Xilai, a leading politician who looks as though he's well and truly going to miss out on a top spot in the Politburo, and in fact probably suffer a great deal more because of alleged corrupt activities under his administration by himself personally and by his wife and by his cronies. Whether he is guilty of all of these things remains to be seen, but certainly corruption is an issue that can be used as a tool. You can use it against your enemies. You can come up with evidence of corruption, and in a sense, I suppose, by bringing it to the fore and by making it obvious, it becomes something that people may try and move away from. But it's a very, very complex issue. We are running to towards the end of our time, so just be very quick. Yeah.
Bill Walker from World Vision. Thanks, Dr. Labelle. I'm just interested in your comment about you're working from the grassroots, this newer fourth area you mentioned of TI, and just interested if you have any comments on the potential or significance of anti-corruption movements, such as we've seen in India in the last year or so.
I think the India case is a very interesting one. And what has happened there, as you know, is that it was a piece of legislation that really mobilized, and with one individual, sort of taking a lead, and he had tried before, but there was no traction. But that piece of legislation suddenly became a lightning rod and was able to just mobilize a whole lot of people. I think that the grassroots movements have their importance. I was telling my friends here a story about being at the World Economic Forum last January at Davos, and where there was a session on social media, and where this organization of one man organization, had been able to get a following of about 12 million people. And he was saying, this is what we need, and there was a lot of rah-rah about this. And a young woman of about 28 years old, a young social entrepreneur, got up, and she was from Egypt. And it was very sobering to listen to her. And she said, yes, we need people to come together. We need people to indicate that in whatever shape and form, peacefully, that something is not acceptable, or a way of life is not acceptable. But she said, if there is not, and she called it a mature leader, who can move this movement from chaos, anarchy, which is, what happens in a case like that, to the solutions and to a future which will be better than the one you had before. You can have chaos and anarchy and not quite know where you're going to land and when. And she was very, very interesting. She was so people just, listened to her very carefully. And she was not saying, let us not have such movements, but let's not pretend that these movements will necessarily bring you something better unless there are certain conditions, unless, someone can bring together, can mobilize, because she was saying you get infiltration of all kinds on the ground, and so what starts as being something terribly constructive, important, relevant, you don't quite know where it's going to land once you start getting the infiltrations. And also, if you don't have somebody who can pick it up and do something and move this to a new constructive governance of the country. So.
Let me make a quick comment on your last comment. In my experience in Rwanda recently, last year, and that's exactly what you just described. For all the criticism of the president, he's moving that country in a certain direction, and it's very, very impressive to see. Amazing.
Yeah. No, well, you see, you whether you agreed or disagreed with Kagame, there was someone who was very strong, who was able to take over and establish a new state. It could have been a new Iran. It didn't turn out that way because of but what he was aiming for. And today, this Rwanda is the only country in the world where 50% of parliamentarians are women.
Another very impressive country, I think.
And the local government, he has passed, when I say he, because I'm sure it was very much he, got his parliament to pass a law whereby local governments have to establish a system of participative democracy locally. And there has to be a number of advisory committees to the local government on a number of files. And the same individual cannot be on more than two, so that you don't have a capture by one individual or a few individuals of what's happening locally. And they have to report to Parliament. The local government has to report to Parliament. And it has to have in their report, the community has to approve the report that the government will bring to this Parliament, that the local government will bring to Parliament. So, I mean, a number of things like that which are fascinating. And they're building the country right now in very, very interesting way.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Labelle. I would like to have been able to continue on with questions, and I know there were some of you who missed out, and I'm sorry about that. Before I ask one of our council members, Tony Fedderson, to move a vote of thanks formally, I'd just like to draw to your attention that Transparency International Australia has provided copies of their most recent annual report, and they're available at the front of the meeting after the meeting. Now I'd like to invite Tony to move a vote of thanks.
Thank you, Les. It's a great honour to be in the position of actually thanking you and congratulating you, I think, at the same time, and the members of Transparency International. I was involved early in the 1990s when Henry Bosch in Australia was working along with the others that were establishing Transparency International there, and I was working with the Committee for Economic Development of Australia at that time. It was a great honour to have been able to feature them and to see today how far Transparency International has come globally. So congratulations to you and to all of you from Transparency International. I'd also like to say that you reminded us that the first thing we need to do is to recognise what is corruption, and that had a resonance with me because one of the other things that I had the privilege of doing was some surveys related to the Commonwealth Business Council with regard to their activities in Australia, and I think the question of corruption arose in that survey, and I was quite shocked actually when one of our senior business leaders mentioned that he felt that we were at risk in certain areas there. I think we felt, in our own country that we were immune. But I won't be too long in speaking and giving you this vote of thanks, but there are things that many things that we can take with us today from what you said, and thank you very much indeed.